I have removed a few pieces here. There's a large gear that goes on right beside this gear here. And there's also another gear that goes on beside this idler gear, or sprocket if you will. Now there's also a large spring and bolt that goes in this direction here and holds on this large gear. Right now, the way this is sitting with those two gears removed, there is no power being transmitted to the track or to the drive shaft. The jack shaft is turning freely, and the jack shaft is turning the chain, this idler gear, and this large gear at the bottom end. This large gear at the bottom end merely floats on top of the drive shaft. This spline here, if I were to turn that, I would turn the drive shaft. Unfortunately, my drive shaft is not free to turn to demonstrate. The large gear that goes on the front here has a indent mechanism that lines up with the other gear adjacent to it. When this is lined up, this gear will transmit power to this spline via the spline inside this gear. This mechanism also floats a little bit. It has a little bit of play, so that when your engine is at idle, the gearing has a little bit of play to float to allow the gears to mesh when you shift. Slide this gear on, and once it is in place, you can see that now we're connected with the drive shaft. I can no longer turn freely, because now the slightly smaller gear behind is now connected to this gear, the larger one, which in turn is connected to the drive shaft through the spline. So currently that would be power transmission in forward mode. Now we enter this gear, which mates up with the idler, like so, and there's also a little bit of play in there. That play also has a little bit of dampening via a spring that just simply inserts in a hole in each of the gears. I'll just turn this slightly to see the hole. There's the hole on the inner one, and there's the spring sitting in the outer one. And they go together like that. And there's somewhat of a kind of a Lovejoy fitting almost that connects these two gears together. So in forward mode, you can see, I'm just going to remove this gear just to demonstrate that in forward mode, everything's going to turn together. Including this large gear that I'm putting on now. It's also going to turn. So this is forward mode. So to recap, we have power transmission from the jack shaft to this sprocket through the chain to the lower small gear inside, which is floating on the drive shaft. It then is coupled directly to this larger gear, which then is splined to the drive shaft. And that's the the forward power transmission. To transmit power in reverse mode, to run the drive shaft in reverse, there's a shift fork that sits right here about how my fingers are. And when you go into reverse, it pulls this large gear out about that far. What happens is that large gear disconnects from the smaller gear, and it disconnects from this coupling here. And as it disconnects from that coupling, it connects to this gear that is turning at the same rate as the idler gear. Now you have power transmission in reverse. As you can see, we have a connection. And what's happening now is the jack shaft is turning the chain. The chain is turning this small gear behind, but now it's just floating on the drive shaft. That small gear is not incurring any load. Now the load is on this sprocket that was floating, and it's transmitting power through this sort of Lovejoy coupling to this other gear, to the small gear beside the small sprocket, the floater sprocket. Then this gear is transmitting power to this large gear. Note that this larger gear is going to give you a lower ratio in reverse. This larger gear is then transmitting power directly to the drive shaft via that spline. To shift back into forward, the shift forks simply push this large gear back into place. And there's a little bit of a spring action there. There, now it's back into place, and now you're in forward gear. Difference being, power is now being transmitted through the gear at the back and no longer being transmitted through this gear here. If all you wanted was forward, you could actually remove this gear. It's not necessary. You will still have forward power transmission. That's the only gear you can afford to lose for forward power. If you're partially shifted into reverse, or your reverse forks are not adjusted properly and you hear gears grinding, those two gears that are grinding are this little one here and this large one here. Right here we can see the teeth on this gear are a little bit beveled or angled, similar to this one, and that's to allow them to mesh properly. So there's an example of the shift there. So this is forward and that is reverse. In reverse, we're connected to the small gear, and forward, the drive shaft is connected to the large gear. Regardless, this gear here is always driving the drive shaft. The power is either coming from the small gear in reverse or from the large gear behind when in forward. I hope that simplifies and explains the shifting of the gear case. Also, one last thing, PS, is this spring that I removed here obviously holds this large gear in forward mode unless the shift forks are pulling it back, of course. So the default is forward. That's all. Thank you.